Well, hello everyone out there. I hope you're doing well and you're staying healthy. My name's Ranger Chad, and as you can tell, I'm not in the Tuskegee Airmen National Historic Site. Unfortunately, due to the COVID-19 pandemic, our visitor center is closed for the time being, and we're unable to conduct our regular Ranger talks. But that doesn't mean we can't still talk about the Tuskegee Airmen here in my home office. So I'd like to welcome you to our very first Virtual Tarmac Talk. Now, in order to kick off this talk, I'd like to start with the basics. Really, who are the Tuskegee Airmen? The simplest answer would just be to say that they were the first African-American pilots in the U.S. military. But the true answer is quite a bit more complicated. There were 992 pilots who graduated from the Tuskegee Airmen program, but for every pilot, 10 to 15 other people were needed in order to make sure those planes got off the ground. These 15,000 ground crew members had jobs ranging from mechanics to nurses, parachute riggers, intelligence officers, cooks, instructors, control tower operators, and just many, many more. All of those 16,000 men and women are considered Tuskegee Airmen. Now, prior to 1941, African Americans were kept segregated while serving in the U.S. military, often relegated to laborer positions in the Army or the Navy. More prestigious positions, such as fighter and bomber pilots, were completely off limits. Now, these limits were imposed due to the military's belief that African Americans did not possess the intelligence to fly such complicated machines. These stereotypical beliefs were actually stated in a 1925 War College study, which was often cited in order to prevent African Americans from being trained as pilots. One thing I'd like to mention at this point is really just how pilots were viewed. Today, there are many pilots, and though it is a prestigious job, it doesn't hold the same awe that it did in the past. The 1930s and 40s, pilots were seen really as the best of the best. Aircraft were new technological marvels, and those men and women that flew really had an aura that surrounded them, commanding both respect and wonder. In those days, seeing a pilot would be kind of analogous to how we would view astronauts today. Really just that kind of amazing person would be a pilot. Now, things for the Tuskegee Airmen, they would end up changing in 1938. This is when the U.S. began the civilian pilot training program, and this program was really instituted in order to increase the number of civilian pilots and to improve the country's military readiness. After World War I, we recognized that air power was going to be a decisive strategic element in this next war, and we didn't have enough pilots to be able to fill the seats of all those cockpits. In 1939, the Tuskegee Institute, which we now call Tuskegee University, began participating in the civilian pilot training program. And in 1940, President Roosevelt was looking to get reelected. And he recognized that he'd need the African American vote to win, and as many politicians do, he made campaign promises. And as part of his campaign, he promised to form a pilot training program for African Americans. And when he wins the election, he holds true to that promise. And Tuskegee was chosen for the location for the segregated training base for pilot training. Now, the decision to have the training here really was in part because the Tuskegee Institute had such high scores in the civilian pilot training program. Also, the great flying weather, somewhere around 350 days a year of good flying weather, also helped. And the Tuskegee Institute really became the civilian contractor that the Army Air Corps used to help build and manage the airmen's first stage training. In June 1941, the Tuskegee experiment, as it will sometimes be referred to, officially began. And it began with the 99th Pursuit Squadron. The 99th would conduct primary flight training at a couple different places, but they would attend ground school at Tuskegee Institute, actually being dormitory there as well. At Moton Field, which is where our site is, the cadets would learn, as the instructors put it, how to fly the Army way, really that first stage of training. Now, if the cadets passed primary flight training after about 9 weeks, they'd move on to basic and advanced flight training at Tuskegee Army Airfield, which would have been about 10 miles or so away from Moton Field. And this base was modeled after existing training bases and had 4 runways, 225 structures, and included a large hospital. Now, the city of Tuskegee itself was rigidly segregated, and leaving the airfield meant that the Tuskegee Airmen were subject to both Jim Crow laws and blatant racism. The airfield actually would become a refuge against some of the hostile South for the Tuskegee Airmen. On March 7th, 1942, the first class of 5 Tuskegee Airmen graduated, pinning on both their wings and earning the right to be called pilots. By April 2nd, the 99th Pursuit Squadron was actually being deployed to North Africa under the command of Benjamin O. Davis, Jr. In Africa, the airmen primarily conducted air-to-ground strafing attacks, both attacking rail depots and enemy airstrips, helping to clear the way for Allied forces. And while the 99th was making a name for itself overseas, training continued for African Americans back home in Tuskegee. 3 squadrons of airmen were combined with the 99th in order to create what was known as the 332nd Fighter Wing. And by June 1944, they were stationed in Ramitelli, Italy. From this point on, the Tuskegee Airmen would mostly be involved in bomber escort missions. Now, as bomber escorts, the Tuskegee Airmen gained really a massive reputation for staying with the bombers and not leaving them defenseless in order to chase down German fighters. A major tactic of the Germans at the time was to send a single German fighter plane to draw off the Allied support fighters, and then would attack with the rest of their squadron, downing the bombers. The Tuskegee Airmen didn't go and chase those aircraft. Instead, they stuck with the bombers, just as Colonel Davis had instructed them. And due to the outstanding protection that the Tuskegee Airmen provided, along with the red-painted tails of their aircraft, they were given the nickname the Red-Tailed Angels by the bomber crews, often, and nowadays just thought of, shortened down to Red Tails. Now, the Tuskegee Airmen, they fought 2 wars. The first was obviously the war against the Axis powers during World War II, but the second war was for something a little different here at home, and that was for equal rights. And this concept of fighting 2 wars was often referred to as a double victory, or double V. And the term was initially used by a man named James G. Thompson in a letter to the Pittsburgh Gazette. In his letter, he asked the question, should I sacrifice my life to live in a country where I'm less than a full citizen or half an American? And it really raised a lot of questions at home, or raised a lot of support at home for this idea of a double victory where things will change back home based upon the Tuskegee Airmen's abilities to pilot craft overseas. After returning home, the Tuskegee Airmen had hoped to come back to the United States that had changed dramatically. Instead, they faced the same discrimination, the same Jim Crow laws, the same voter suppression, and racism that they had left when fighting against America's enemies overseas. The Tuskegee Airmen continued to fight injustice here at home, desperately hoping to win that second victory. One of the more famous events in this fight was the Freeman Field Mutiny. This is when, at the Army Air Force Base Freeman Field, home of the 477th Bombardment Group, which was training there, the commanding officer, Colonel Selway, had set up 2 separate officers' clubs, one for white troops and one for black troops. This move was against Army regulations, but the colonel justified it by classifying all of the Tuskegee Airmen as trainees, even though some had already seen combat. On April 5th, groups of the Tuskegee Airmen began to attempt to integrate the White Officers Club. By the end of the next day, 61 men had been put under arrest for the protest. 3 of these men would end up being court-martialed, with one of them, Lieutenant Roger Terry, being found guilty. He'd be forced to pay a fine, dishonorably discharged, and barred from all future federal positions. After these events, Colonel Selway ordered all of the Tuskegee Airmen to sign a newly drafted base regulation that denoted the use of specific facilities based upon race. 101 of the airmen refused to sign, even though they were disobeying a direct order, which during a time of war could carry the penalty of death. All 101 men were placed under arrest and confined to quarters. Eventually, public pressure forced the release of the airmen, except for the 3 that were court-martialed, including Lieutenant Terry, though all received official reprimands in their files. On July 1st, 1945, Colonel Benjamin O. Davis Jr. took command of the 477th, and tensions eased. Japan surrendered, however, before the 477th could be put into action. Though the Tuskegee Airmen, they left many legacies, one of the most profound was their contribution to the desegregation of the U.S. military. In 1948, President Harry S. Truman signed Executive Order 9981. This executive order would officially end segregation in the U.S. military and came about in part because of the Tuskegee Airmen's distinguished performance during World War II. The Tuskegee Airmen left other legacies, though, as well. They had many more adversities that they had to overcome than their white counterparts, both during training, their combat overseas, and after they returned home. And the Tuskegee Airmen showed the nation how through determination, African Americans could fly, fight, and win. I'd like to thank you for joining us here on this Virtual Tarmac Talk, and I hope to see you again next time